to Camp Constitution Radio with your host, Hal Shurtleff. This show is heard on WBCQ, The Planet, every Monday night at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it is repeated on Thursday nights, 7:30 p.m., also Eastern Standard Time. You could also pick up this show on Camp Constitution's YouTube channel, as well as Podomatic, podomatic.com. Just put in Camp Constitution Radio. It is brought to you by Camp Constitution, which, among other things, runs a week-long family camp. This next year's camp will be held at the beautiful Lakeside Christian Camp and Conference Center in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And we've got a great lineup of instructors already, and we're hoping to get some more guest instructors. You can also, we have the Sam Blumenfeld archives, and if you go to our website, and you'll see the drop-down, and you have access to some incredible materials. And we have a guest on the line, and that would be Andy Schlafly. Andy is involved with the Phyllis Schlafly Eagles. Good evening, Andy.
Good evening, Al. Thanks for having me on your show.
Well, it's a delight. I've not met you in person, although I've met your late mother on a number of occasions, and we're in communication, especially during this the last several years when the Article 5 supporters have been extremely active. So tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and then we'll get into the Article 5 issue.
I was an engineer coming out of college, Hal, and I worked for a number of years in that field, electrical engineering and some computer programming. Then I went to law school. Actually, I was a classmate of Barack Obama at Harvard Law School. We were on the law review together. He wasn't around that much, but I did meet him and know him there. And he was being groomed for presidency about 20 years later. Well, more than 20 years, I guess. I mean, I graduated in 1991. So, no, about 17 years later, he became president. And he was being groomed back then for that.
By the way, did you know Professor Tom Woods? Did you know Professor Tom Woods?
I do know him. I've heard him speak. He was not. I didn't have any classes with him at Harvard, but I have heard him speak, and he's a brilliant man.
Because I knew him when he was just I tease him about it. He was just a young, naive student at Harvard, and now he's a New York Times bestseller author. So
yes.
Yeah. So anyway, the Article 5. Let's. Why don't you just let the listeners? We've covered this issue a whole lot. I've had some incredible people on, attorneys and experts on the subject, and you're the latest of this long list. So just give the listeners a little background on what exactly is an Article 5 convention.
If you pull out your Constitution, you can see it's divided into several articles. There's Article 1, which is about the legislative branch or Congress. Article 2 sets up the executive branch or the presidency. Article 3 sets up the federal judiciary and the Supreme Court. Well, Article 5 governs amendments to the Constitution and the process for amending or changing the U.S. Constitution. And there are two processes that are set up in Article 5. One is the way that it's been done more than 24 times, which is for Congress to pass by a 2/3 majority, both in the House and then in the Senate, a proposed amendment, and then it goes to the states, where if 3/4 of the states pass the proposed amendment, then it is ratified and it becomes part of the Constitution. That is the regular way that it has been done. There is an alternative way that has never been used, and it was suggested by George Mason, who ended up opposing the ratification of the Constitution, but he wanted an alternative mechanism whereby if 2/3 of the states apply to Congress to call a constitutional convention, then a constitutional convention or Article 5 convention, those are the same things, would convene, and Congress would be making the call for it, and multiple amendments could then be proposed by this Article 5 convention, which would then go to the states for ratification by 3/4 of the states. So if you look in your pocket Constitution or online, you'll see that there are these two mechanisms for modifying the Constitution, one which has been used successfully more than 24 times, and then the other which has never been used, because what happens is if you call an Article 5 convention, then it cannot be limited in what it does. It could rewrite the whole Constitution. It would be like a runaway freight train that could not be stopped once it gets started. And that's why we're opposed to it. That's one of the reasons. We're opposed to it for multiple reasons, but I would say perhaps the biggest reason we're opposed to it, Hal, is because there's no way to limit the subject matter of an Article 5 convention. It can be called to rein in federal spending, but as soon as they get there, they could repeal the Second Amendment, for example.
And we've never held one, and I think there's something to be said about that. If it was such a great idea, if our founders wrote it in there for times such as these, as the Article 5 supporters of the Convention of States say, you think we've had a whole bunch of them. And I think it's very clear that our founders made it extremely difficult to amend the Constitution for good reason. 3/4 is very difficult to get anywhere. And I said there's two. I love my two favorite fractions are 2/3 and 3/4. You know, and the Electoral College. Those are the three biggest gifts we got. Now
right.
I was at the 2011 conference September at Harvard Law School. I was there with media credentials, where I think this latest drive was kicked off, and you had groups that came out of. I should say that out of that meeting. Several groups formed. One of them was Convention of States. The other one was Wolfpack. And then I think there's a group called Move to Amend, which is Larry Lessig's group. Mr. Mark Meckler and Larry Lessig were the two people that sponsored this event. And I remember I actually was able to, we weren't able to do any interviews inside the building, but outside we did. And at that time, I didn't know who Cenk Uygur was. I knew who Larry Lessig was. And I had my camera on, and there's Larry Lessig chatting with Cenk Uygur, and they're laughing about hoping for a runaway convention. And then they deny that such a thing can happen. So I think we should address that. In my opinion, the very nature of an Article 5 convention is runaway, since it cannot be limited.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's what conventions do. And my mother, Phyllis Schlafly, she would talk about how many of the supporters of an Article 5 convention don't really have experience in participating in conventions themselves. My mother did. She was at the Republican National Convention every time from 1952 to 2016 when Trump was nominated, except for two conventions. She was a delegate or alternate delegate from 1952 to 2016. What is that? Hal, that's 64 years, and that's a record that no one's going to be breaking, I don't think. And she knew a thing or two about conventions. She really did. And some of these people, certainly the people who are bankrolling this Article 5 convention, I don't think they know diddly squat about how conventions really function. I don't think the Koch brothers have ever been a delegate to the Republican National Convention. Maybe they have. I don't know. I think one of the brothers, for example, I think was nominated on the Libertarian Party ticket at one point. So maybe he knows a little bit about conventions, but certainly not a convention on the scale of the Republican Party National Convention. And here's what we'll get if we get an Article 5 convention. We'll get the Republicans and the Democrats together in the same room. Imagine how divisive that would be. In other words, a convention that is both Republican and Democratic, with all the chaos in there and all the conflicts and all the Soros-funded protesters and all that, that is what the convention would be. And there's no telling what would come out of that.
It was interesting, too. I think there are some well-intentioned people in the conservative side of the spectrum. Some, not all. Some of them aren't so well-intentioned. But they actually think that this is going to be run by Michael Farris. I'm being a little facetious. It will be held at the Patrick Henry College. And the only delegates will be in there were those that Mike Farris allows. And nothing, not one single amendment that would be crazy, however you define that, will ever come out of that. But the reality is you're going to have people on the far left spectrum, Democrats, and a good chunk of the Republicans whose views aren't shared by folks like you and I and many of our listeners. They're neocon, they're liberals. They have contempt and disgust for the Constitution, and they want to see some profound changes in that. Now, I got a chance to interview John Eidsmoe, who's someone I'm sure you know,
yes.
an attorney.
Oh, absolutely.
And
he's wonderful.
He's a great man. I asked him, can members of Congress be delegates to this convention? And he said, there's nothing saying they can't. So who would the delegates be? To me, if I'm going to have a surgical procedure, I want to know who the surgeon is and maybe the anesthesiologist. I want to make sure they're sound. Who would the delegates be at this convention?
Congress would define that because Congress does the call. So again, if we look at our Constitution, we see that it's Congress that calls the convention. The states merely apply for it. So the whole name Convention of States is a misnomer. The states really have very little control over it. They ask Congress to call the convention, then it's Congress that calls the convention, and they could set the rules for who the delegates would be, and they may just simply take it for themselves. And the notion that we have to do this to rein in Congress, quite the contrary. This would give Congress more power, and it would give Congress the power to rewrite the Constitution, which they do not have now, fortunately. And so the delegates would very well be, many of them would be congressmen, and many of them would be lobbyists, and people who throw around money, and people who are good at that sort of thing. And conservatives in general, Hal, and I've been around conservatives a long time, and one myself, you as well, I think we should recognize that conservatives are not necessarily the best people at politicking and taking control of a convention that requires some deceit. There may be bribery that happens in an Article 5 convention. We don't do that. We don't do that sort of thing. And it really is a process. I mean, if you ask yourself, how many conservative speakers of the House have there been in the history of our country? I can't name any. I don't know if you can.
You think awfully hard, don't you? It definitely wasn't Tip O'Neill.
No, and this is not, conservatives don't like doing the things that other people do to take control of these deliberative bodies. And we believe in rule of law. We believe in principles. We believe that law should govern, not men. And so the notion that an Article 5 convention would be run by conservatives is contrary to my experience in politics, and maybe yours as well, Hal. And I'll tell you, at one point, Michael Farris actually said on a conference call that he thought he would be chosen to preside over an Article 5 convention. Well, there's zero chance of that. Zero chance. And I would say there's almost zero chance that any conservative would be picked to preside over an Article 5 convention.
I could see people like Cenk Uygur and Larry Lessig say, "Hey, thanks a lot, Mike, for the help. Now get lost." We're taking
That's exactly
over.
what happened. It'd get taken away from them. Yeah.
You've debated Mike Farris on the subject, I
did.
believe, down in New Jersey, and I'm sure
I did.
And now this year, this 2018, it's middle of October to late October, and so far this year, not one new resolution has passed any state. And just recently, we had a victory in Pennsylvania, and you played a big role in that. Can you tell the listeners what happened there?
Yeah, we had a fabulous hearing in Pennsylvania, Hal, and it was sought by the Article 5 Convention of States group to hold a hearing, and it was a fair hearing. And because it was a fair hearing, we got to speak out about the many arguments against an Article 5 convention. Mike Fulmer was the chairman of the committee. It was the Pennsylvania Senate State Government Committee, and he did a wonderful job, and he asked good questions. And at the end of the day, many in attendance, it was a crowded gallery, standing room only, and many came up to our side afterwards, thanking us for articulating the many good reasons why we do not want to risk our prosperity and our freedoms on this radical idea of an Article 5 Convention of States.
What I liked about is that the other side, Convention of States, Wolfpack, they seem to have unlimited amounts of money. I remember one particular time, I live in Boston, and New Hampshire, Concord, New Hampshire is about, 75-mile ride. And I had to borrow money from my son to put gas in the tank to testify. And these folks fly in from all over the country, people like Farris and Tom Colburn and Mark Meckler. They stay at nice 4- or 5-star hotels. They come in and do their testifying, and they go out. But they have, I would say, unlimited access to neoconservative talk show. They got Sean Hannity, and I agree with Sean Hannity on some things, but they have Mark Levin, who's been a big supporter of this, Rush Limbaugh, and many, many others. Well, but they never give us any equal time. I don't remember Hannity or Limbaugh or Levin will just go off on you and he used to be against one. And what's ironic about Levin is that he considers the late Judge Robert Bork to be the greatest legal mind of his time. And he was against an Article 5 convention. He doesn't like to be reminded of that, I don't think. So I think it's just almost miraculous that we've been able to not just hold them off, but a few states have rescinded their applications over the last several years. Not enough. Where do we stand right now with an Article 5 convention?
They have about a dozen states, and you're right, Hal. This year we had a perfect record of defeating it in about 19 states now, including Pennsylvania, and they were not able to pass it in a single state. And the Convention of States people were telling the public and probably their donors that they thought this thing that they might get it ratified by this time, get the 2/3 states they needed. Well, they struck out this year, and it's not for lack of trying. They threw around a lot of money, and they pushed hard, very hard. In many states beginning at the beginning of the year, and they'll probably push hard again next year, but we beat them every single time. It was just a phenomenal run that we had this year and stopped them. And of the dozen states that they have passed it, a few of those states have sunset provisions. So they're going to start to run up against an expiration of the Convention of States in some of those states, such as Missouri. Yeah, Missouri passed a resolution, it was last year, and they included a 5-year sunset provision. So 4 years from now, Missouri will go bye-bye.
Automatically rescind.
Well,
12, they've been around since, 2013?
Yeah.
Or 2012, and you look at all the money, and they've got 12 states. And I think I did a little calculation of how many millions of dollars per state. And I'm thinking if they use that money to help create informed voters and get some constitutionals elected, I think we would have Congress and we would have not just a conservative but a constitutional majority. And they claim, I don't know, several million members. And I did the breakdown. New Hampshire, I figured, let's do the breakdown here. There should have been at least 20,000 members of Convention of States just in New Hampshire alone. And I have to say they do got some good organizational skills. There's no question about that. But this year, I think that they have failed every year. They passed it at the committee level, the Federal Affairs Committee, but then it goes to a full vote in the House. It's either tabled, it's tabled generally. It even passed the Senate, and then it went to the House, and it was tabled again. But this year, the New Hampshire committee, the Federal Affairs Committee, 18-1 against it. I mean, I think that one vote was probably, they almost felt sorry for him. And it was Tom Colburn who was, and I have to say, he's a likable guy. Mark Meckler is not likable, but I have to say Colburn is a likable man, and he's a medical doctor, and I think we probably agree with him on most issues. But he came in, he testified after I did, and then there was a little conversation after the hearing, and I asked him about his vote on the Bush bailout. And he was talking about one of the talking points, as you know, the Convention of States has, is this idea of two constitutions. The one that we carry in our pocket here, and the this other Constitution that's 2,000 pages full of Supreme Court rulings and annotations. And I asked him, I said, I couldn't resist. I said, which Constitution did you refer to when you voted for the Bush bailout? And he didn't skip a beat. He said, I was wrong. And I'm thinking, here's a guy that's a pretty honorable individual that let us down when he had the chance. He could have said no, but he's being pressured. He was all this pressure, from everywhere, all sources, in his own party, from John McCain, and everyone else. In fact, I recall John McCain actually suspended his campaign, as well as Obama did, to lobby, to make sure they got the votes, and he failed us. And I say to his supporters, would you trust him at an Article 5 convention when he demonstrated he already failed under pressure?
Excellent point.
Yeah. So what other states do we have? Is it Michigan? Is that the next state where there might be some hearings?
They've been trying in Michigan, but I think we've defeated it there. So I think we're fine in Michigan for the rest of the session. Sometimes in Michigan they have a little lame duck session after the election, so we got to keep an eye on that. Make sure that the Convention of States people don't try to slip something through. They're very sneaky. They'll have hearings that are not fair. They'll try to slip legislation through when no one's looking. They'll post bills right before a vote. I mean, they're resorting to every trick in the book. So we do have to remain very watchful and not take anything for granted. But I think we've defeated Michigan. I think we're probably pretty good for the rest of the year. And it looks like we're going to have a perfect
January.
score. In January, they'll start again. I mean, they're spending millions on this, so they'll start up again.
I think that I don't want to be overly optimistic, but it looks like even with all the money, they still have to have their foot soldiers. And unfortunately, most Americans, when it comes to almost anything, after a couple of years of working hard, they sort of give up. Hey, look, we got a guy in the White House that's pretty good. We got to so maybe we'll wait it out. And I'm hoping that will happen, and it will at least be petered out, and even with all the money they have. But one of the guys that was a Convention of States operative in New England and the Northeast, he's now he had been involved with the term limits. And it's almost like they're switching gears a little bit from an article from what they call a Convention of States to a term limit convention. And I think that might be their strategy, is to you see people like Pelosi and Feinstein that have been there forever, and it's an emotional appeal. We need to have term limits now, and no way to do it is through an amendment. And I counter with, we have term limits every 2 years. We have a November election. We're going to have hopefully some people will be limited by the voters.
That's right, Hal. And term limits, there are people on both sides of that debate, but I will say we may not even need a constitutional amendment for term limits at this point, because we've had changeover in the Supreme Court. And the 5-4 court that struck down term limits as unconstitutional, that 5-4 court is no longer there. That majority is no longer there. And my guess is, I know Gorsuch is in favor of the constitutionality of term limits. I imagine Kavanaugh is. There's probably a 5-4 majority on the court now.
Are you speaking of states that try to limit the terms of their congressional delegation?
Yes.
Yeah, because I know that there was a case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, U.S. term limits versus Thornton. I'm not sure where Thornton was from, but it was the name of the case is U.S. term limits versus Thornton. I think it was decided in 1995, and it was 5-4, striking down a state law that limited the congressional term limits. It's fully constitutional to do it at the state level. There are many states right now that have term limits, but as you say, I mean, there's certainly issues on both sides. We do have term limits that people can vote every 2 years. So
that's right.
And there are some good congressmen and senators who've been in there more than the term limit terms. So people should be careful what they ask for. Chuck Grassley is an example of that. I mean, most of us are very pleased with Chuck Grassley's handling of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He's been there a long time. He wouldn't be there if term limits were in effect.
Because with the bad will go out the good too. And You get a congressman or woman that's been there a long time, and they know the ropes, and they have their connections, and they're doing the right thing. They're voting the way they should most of the time. Why would you want to limit them out unless you get to you vote them out at the ballot box? Now, one of the accusations that we get, they'll say the Convention of States people will say, "Well, what's your plan? You have no plan. We have a $21 trillion national debt and so forth and so on. So what's your plan?" So I said, "Well, gee, thank you. Now you got a chance. We've been trying to get your attention for all this time. Now you're asking us what our plan is." So when they ask you, "What's your plan?" what do you tell them?
I said at the hearing, Hal, that we all need to do more to stay involved, to elect good people, and to stay engaged after we elect good people so that we're in touch with them. And there has been some progress on some issues, as I said at this Pennsylvania hearing. The issue of debt is not the only issue. There are other issues out there, and we have made some progress on the Second Amendment, for example. Over the last 20, 30 years, we've made some progress on financial freedom. I pointed out at this hearing in Pennsylvania, if one goes back 50 years, it was illegal to own gold. Individuals could not own gold. You remember, Hal? Okay, there you go. It's hard to find someone who remembers that.
I remember that. I think it was Congressman Ron Paul back in the 70s that was, and a few others that were able to repeal those laws. That goes back to the Franklin Roosevelt administration.
Yeah. And so we have much greater financial freedom today than we did 50 years ago. And a lot of people don't believe that. When I said that at the hearing, you could just feel the air go out of the room of people in disbelief that it was once, in the not too distant past, I remember it, it was once illegal for an individual American to own a gold bar, a gold coin, whatever. Could not own gold. So
I think unless it was
a
numismatic coin.
It used to be it was illegal to get a market rate of interest on your savings. You were stuck with the government-regulated passbook savings rate. And then we started to have mutual funds come on where you could get a better return on your money. That was an innovation that was not allowed 50 years ago. So we've made some progress on some fronts, and let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. There have been good things that have happened, and one of the things that we do, what we observe here at Camp Constitution, that most Americans, even conservatives, really know very little about the Constitution. So we make an effort to reach out where we can to teach people about the Constitution. And I think if most people knew about the Constitution, they would fire their elected officials at all levels, or at least demand that they start obeying it. And I think that's really the bottom. That's the bottom line. I think, and of course we have a spiritual problem too, and that's something that has to be resolved. I can't imagine, the moral caliber of the convention of 1787 compared to today. The moral caliber is far different, and that's something that it's something we have to see through the churches and individuals in the churches making a difference in that regard too. Because that's not going to be an Article 5 convention will not restore our nation's spirituality. No.
And it will reflect.
As I pointed out at the hearing. As I pointed out at the hearing at the original Constitutional Convention, all those participants had personally sacrificed their lives to save our country and obtain the freedoms that we then enjoyed in the Revolutionary War. They'd all participated in the Revolutionary War. Had the personal sacrifice of potentially losing their own lives. Well, we're not going to have that today. I mean, we're not going to.
No.
A convention today would have very few veterans.
We're down to a minute here. I want your testimony is available in Pennsylvania. Is available on a website.
Yes. Yes.
How would people get that there?
You go to the Senate Pennsylvania State Government Committee website. You then there are tabs where you can sort of look at committee hearings and stuff, and you can click on the hearings, and then you get a choice there, and it's archived there on that Pennsylvania Senate legislative site and just archive for the hearings. And let's see, the date of it was last Wednesday, so that would have been the 17th. It was October the 17th in the morning, Pennsylvania Senate State Government Committee, and it's archived there. You just click on it and you can watch it.
And if folks want to get a hold of you or your organization, how can they do that?
Email is the best way to do that. So please email me give you my email address. It's my first initial and last name at AOL.com. So it's A-S like Sam, C like Charlie, H-L-A-F like Frank, L-Y at AOL.com. Or you can also, another way you can get me is easier to remember, is Andy at pseagles.com. Go ahead, Hal.
All right, great. Well, thank you for being a guest on the show, and we'll hopefully do it again down the road as time goes on. And folks, thank you for listening. You've been listening to Camp Constitution Radio on WBCQ The Planet. And until next week, may God richly bless you.
Thank you, Hal.